There is a moment that happens to certain people, not everyone, but some. It does not come with a flash of lightning or a dramatic turning point. It does not appear because you read the perfect book, or met the ideal teacher, or attended a life-changing retreat in the mountains. It simply arrives quietly, like a window gently opening in a room that has been sealed for years. In that moment, something inside you recognizes that the life you have been living, the version of yourself you have been acting out, the game you have been playing without ever questioning its rules, none of it fits the way it once did. The shoes feel too tight. The mask feels too heavy. The script you have been following feels like it was written for someone else entirely. That is what some people refer to as a spiritual awakening. And it is important to clear something up about that phrase, because many people hear it and imagine someone sitting peacefully on a mountaintop with a glowing face and perfect serenity. That is not what this is about. What this really is something far more ordinary and far more real. At its core, a spiritual awakening is simply the process of becoming more honest. More honest about who you truly are, more honest about what you genuinely want, and more honest about what you have been carrying that was never really yours to carry in the first place. When this process begins, something very interesting starts to happen. You begin to let things go, not because you planned to, not because someone instructed you to, but because you genuinely can no longer hold on to them. It feels as if your hands are slowly, naturally opening. Today, we are talking about 7 of those things. 7 patterns, habits, and ways of being that people consistently notice fading away as they begin to awaken to their deeper selves. These are not things you consciously decide to quit. They are things that quietly become impossible to continue. If you have been feeling lately like something is shifting within you, like you are becoming someone you do not fully recognize yet, like the things that once motivated you are losing their hold, then this is meant for you. Let us begin. One of the first things that starts to fade is the deep hunger for approval. This is one of the most deeply ingrained patterns most of us carry. The need for others to tell us that we are okay. Think about how early this need is installed. From childhood, approval becomes a form of survival. You behave properly, you receive a smile. You achieve something, you are praised. You fit in, you are accepted. Even small moments of rejection can feel like a threat to the nervous system. So you learn to scan the room, to read the environment, and to adjust yourself accordingly. By adulthood, this becomes automatic. You shape your opinions based on who is around. You soften your personality in certain settings. You say yes when you mean no. You laugh when you do not find something funny. You hide parts of yourself and exaggerate others. For a long time, this works, or at least it functions. It keeps social harmony. It maintains a sense of belonging. But something begins to shift when you start waking up. The approval-seeking mechanism begins to break down. You might find yourself in the middle of a conversation, about to say what someone wants to hear, and something inside you simply refuses. Not out of rebellion, but from something deeper. It feels like your body has developed an intolerance. People describe it as trying to wear something that used to fit but no longer does. You keep trying, but it just does not work anymore. Eventually, you stop trying. This transition is not always comfortable. There is often a phase where you no longer depend on approval internally, but your external life has not caught up. You might still notice yourself checking for validation or feeling a slight sting when it is absent. But the key difference is that now you are aware of it. You are no longer fully inside the pattern. And on the other side of that phase, something powerful emerges. A steady sense of self-worth that does not rely on external confirmation. Not arrogance, not indifference, but a quiet understanding that your value does not need to be approved by others. Another thing that begins to fall away is the need to be seen as special. This may sound surprising because it seems like something worth keeping, but there is a difference between truly being yourself and needing to appear exceptional. In the early stages of awakening, it is common for the ego to take on a new form. You may have genuine insights or experiences, and then subtly begin using them to stand out. You might mention your practices more often, speak in certain ways, or feel slightly superior to others. This phase is real and quite common. But if growth continues, something eventually shifts. You begin to see this behavior clearly. You realize you are turning inner experience into a kind of performance. There may be a moment where you catch yourself and recognize what is happening. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The need to be perceived as advanced or special begins to dissolve. What remains is something far more genuine. When the performance drops, your real self begins to emerge. Being ordinary no longer feels like a loss. It feels like relief, a quiet freedom from needing to prove anything. Another pattern that starts to fade is the performance of constant positivity. There is a strong cultural pressure to always appear positive, especially in personal growth spaces. To always be calm, always peaceful, always above struggle. This creates a kind of mask. Not just a social mask, but a spiritual one. Phrases and ideas that may hold truth can become shields that prevent real emotional experience. As awakening deepens, this mask becomes harder to maintain. It begins to feel heavy and unnatural. Eventually, it starts to fall away. This does not mean becoming negative. It means becoming honest. Emotions like grief, anger, and fear are no longer avoided or suppressed. They are allowed to exist, to be felt, and to pass naturally. There is a difference between pretending to be okay and genuinely arriving at a sense of peace after facing what is difficult. People begin to understand this difference more clearly. Another thing that begins to dissolve is the need for certainty. Many of us build our lives around what we believe we know. We define ourselves through fixed ideas about who we are, what we believe, and how the world works. These certainties create a sense of safety. They feel like solid ground, but they also limit growth. When you are certain, you stop questioning, you stop exploring. Awakening slowly loosens this grip. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin to notice that what you thought you knew may not be as fixed as it seemed. This can feel unsettling at first, but it also creates space. Space for curiosity, for openness, for new understanding. The loss of certainty becomes the beginning of a deeper kind of freedom. And as this continues, life begins to feel less like something that needs to be controlled, and more like something that can be experienced. The rigid structures soften. The need to have all the answers fades. What remains is a quieter, more flexible way of being. One that is not based on rigid definitions, but on presence and awareness. These shifts do not happen overnight. They unfold slowly, often in ways that are difficult to notice at first. But over time, the patterns that once defined you begin to lose their grip. What replaces them is not something new that you add, but something that was always there underneath. A more honest, more grounded version of yourself that no longer needs to perform, prove, or pretend. And while the process can feel disorienting at times, it also carries a quiet sense of rightness. As if, for the first time, you are beginning to live in alignment with something real. You begin to realize that an opinion you once held very strongly was actually something you absorbed from your surroundings without ever truly questioning it. You notice that you were mistaken about something you felt completely certain about. And each small unraveling starts to show you that certainty itself may not be the solution, but part of the limitation. Then it goes deeper. You find yourself less sure about why certain things unfolded the way they did in your past. Less sure about other people's intentions, including those you believed you understood completely. Less sure about your own identity, about what you really are beneath all the roles, labels, and stories you have carried. A man who spent many years in academic research described this experience as the most unsettling gift he had ever received. He had built his entire identity around being someone who understood things, the analyst, the expert, the one with answers. And then, slowly, his intellectual certainty began to feel empty. Not exactly wrong, but incomplete. Like he had been studying the menu and calling it the meal. He shared something worth sitting with for a moment. He said that the less certain he became, the more present he felt. Because certainty lives in the past and the future, in what you think you have figured out and what you have already decided. Presence exists in the open, unresolved moment, the truly curious moment. On the other side of losing certainty is something often forgotten: wonder. The ability to be genuinely surprised by life, to not already assume the answer before the question has even finished. To hold two opposing ideas at once without forcing them into a single conclusion. This is not confusion. It is what real wisdom feels like from within, not the collection of answers, but the expansion of your ability to live within questions. Another pattern that slowly dissolves is blame as a way of living. This one can be especially difficult to release because it often feels justified, even earned. Not just blaming others in everyday situations, but the deeper habit of organizing your life story around what was done to you. Making sense of your pain through the lens of who caused it. Building part of your identity around your wounds and who is responsible for them. It is important to acknowledge that some of what happened to you was not your fault. Some of the harm was real, serious, and caused by real people making real choices. Recognizing that matters. Sitting with it honestly matters. Processing it matters. What begins to shift is what comes after that. The point where blame, which once helped identify the source of pain, becomes the place you remain stuck within. Blame has a powerful and appealing logic. It explains everything. It protects your sense of innocence. It can even connect you with others who share similar experiences. But it also quietly limits movement. As long as the problem exists entirely outside of you, there is nothing within your control to change. As people move through deeper awareness, they start noticing recurring patterns. The same kinds of dynamics showing up again and again in relationships, work, friendships. The same emotional patterns repeating with different faces. Eventually, a question arises that changes everything. Not why this keeps happening to me, but what role am I playing in this? This question does not come from self-blame or the idea that harm was deserved. It comes from a deep desire to reclaim ownership of your life. A woman who carried real and valid pain from her childhood described reaching a moment that felt both terrifying and liberating. She saw how she had built her identity around being the one who was wronged. And she recognized how that identity had also kept her disconnected from her own power. Letting go of blame did not mean excusing those who hurt her. It meant releasing herself from the grip of helplessness. It meant no longer waiting for others to change or apologize before allowing herself to move forward. People who release blame do not become passive or unaware. They become stronger in a grounded way. They stop waiting for someone else to rewrite their story. They begin writing it themselves. Another pattern that begins to fall away is using spirituality as a form of escape. This one can be subtle and difficult to recognize because it often looks like growth from the outside. You go through something painful, a loss, a breakup, or a deep personal shift, and you respond by diving deeply into spiritual practices. You meditate more. You read extensively about consciousness and detachment. You speak about acceptance and the illusion of the ego. On the surface, this appears wise, but sometimes the framework becomes a way to avoid the experience rather than move through it. You do not actually grieve, you analyze grief. You do not fully feel anger, you reinterpret it. You do not sit with loneliness, you remind yourself that separation is an illusion. This is often called spiritual bypassing, and it is a very common detour. The sign is usually found in the body. The emotions you have reframed do not disappear. They remain stored in tension, in restlessness, in unease. The mind may understand everything, but the body still holds the experience. Real growth eventually asks for full embodiment. Not just the peaceful insights, but the entire human experience. The grief, the longing, the discomfort, the need for connection, all of it. A man who had practiced meditation for over 15 years came to understand this after a period of deep personal loss. He had all the knowledge and techniques, but he realized he had been using them to avoid his own pain. He had to relearn how to feel, how to cry, how to admit fear, how to need others. He described it as returning to the ground after being suspended for a long time. It felt heavier, but also more real. The invitation is not to abandon spiritual practices, but to stop using them as an escape. To allow them to become a way of entering life more deeply, rather than avoiding it. Finally, one of the quietest patterns that begins to dissolve is the identity of being the awakened one. Early on, this identity can feel logical. You begin seeing things differently than those around you. You question what others do not question. You feel a sense of distance from the patterns you once shared. This can create a feeling of separation. Conversations that once felt normal may now feel shallow. But there is a turning point here. One path turns that separation into a story of superiority. The belief that you are more aware, more advanced, more awake than others. This idea can feel comforting because it explains the distance. But there is another path. One that leads to something much deeper. People who continue to grow begin to see through this narrative. They realize that the sense of separation was not a sign of awakening, but a reflection of an unhealed need to feel above something. They see that the isolation they interpreted as growth was actually rooted in fear. Fear of being seen fully. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of real connection. When this layer fades, something remarkable happens. They find themselves able to connect with almost anyone. Not by pretending or diminishing themselves, but by recognizing their shared humanity, by remembering their own past patterns, by developing real compassion for others who are still navigating similar struggles. A woman who spent years in what she described as spiritual isolation experienced this shift during a simple moment on a flight. She was sitting next to a man speaking loudly on his phone, frustrated and overwhelmed. At first, she felt irritation and distance. But then something shifted. She saw a reflection of her past self in him. Not who she was now, but who she had been years ago. And instead of judgment, she felt understanding. A warmth opened within her, a sense of connection that did not require him to change. That is what genuine awakening begins to look like. Not separation, but deeper and more honest connection. Not retreating into a group of like-minded individuals, but meeting people where they are, including yourself, in all the places you are still growing. These are the patterns that gradually fall away as you begin to wake up to your real life. Not through force or decision, but through a quiet and steady shift in awareness. What remains is not something new you acquire, but something that was always there, waiting underneath.